Tonight, we travel back more than 700 years into the quiet world of medieval Europe. Imagine a cold evening settling over a small stone village. A gentle breeze moves through the trees, while the distant call of an owl echoes beneath the moonlit sky. Inside a modest home, the warm glow of a crackling fireplace softly lights the room. There is no electricity, no smartphones, and no ticking alarm clocks. You might assume that people simply climbed into bed and slept for 8 uninterrupted hours. But history tells a very different story. Surprisingly, many medieval people did not sleep through the entire night. Instead, they followed a pattern known today as segmented sleep. They would enjoy a first sleep for several peaceful hours. Then, sometime around midnight, they would naturally wake up. This wasn't considered unusual or unhealthy. It was simply part of everyday life. During this quiet period, some people added, as the evening slowly faded into darkness, medieval families prepared for the night in ways that might seem unfamiliar to us today. Without electric lights, the setting sun naturally signaled the end of most daily activities. Candles were expensive, and even simple oil lamps were used sparingly. Every flickering flame represented something valuable, so people rarely wasted light after dark. One by one, families gathered around the warmth of a small fireplace. The last meal of the day was often simple, perhaps a bowl of thick vegetable stew, a piece of coarse bread, or a small serving of cheese. Wealthier households might enjoy roasted meat or fresh fish, but for most ordinary people, dinner remained modest and filling. As the fire crackled softly, conversations became quieter. Parents reminded their children to say evening prayers. The oldest members of the family shared familiar stories that had been passed down through generations. Outside, the village slowly disappeared beneath the gentle blanket of night. There were no glowing screens, no late-night television, no endless scrolling through social media. Only silence, broken occasionally by the distant bark of a dog, the rustling of leaves, or the soft whisper of the wind. Eventually, everyone settled into bed, but these beds were nothing like the comfortable mattresses we know today. Most ordinary families slept on simple straw-filled mattresses placed on wooden frames or directly on the floor. The straw was replaced only from time to time, meaning the bedding could become rough, dusty, and sometimes even home to tiny insects. Warm wool blankets help protect sleepers from the cold. During harsh winters, several family members often shared the same bed, not only because beds were expensive, but because sleeping together helped preserve body heat. The room itself remained surprisingly dark. The fire gradually faded into glowing embers. Shadows danced gently across the stone walls. Before long, breathing slowed. Eyes closed. The first sleep had begun. For several peaceful hours, the village rested in complete stillness. Then, sometime after midnight, something rather unexpected happened. Many people simply woke up, not because of fear, not because of loud noises, not because of bad dreams. They awoke naturally as though their bodies expected it. For them, this quiet period between the first and second sleep was completely normal. No one rushed back to bed. No one worried about insomnia. Instead, they accepted these silent hours as a peaceful part of life. Some quietly added another piece of wood to the fire. Others whispered gentle prayers. A few reflected on dreams they had just experienced. Some simply sat in silence, listening to the soft sounds of the sleeping village outside. It was a calm moment, unlike anything many of us experience today. And after an hour or sometimes even two, they returned to bed. Their second sleep carried them gently through the remaining darkness until the first birds began singing and the sky slowly welcomed another new day. Now that the quiet midnight hours have settled around us, let us slowly step inside an ordinary medieval home. Take a gentle breath. Imagine a narrow dirt road leading to a small wooden cottage. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and burning firewood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks only once before silence returns. As you quietly open the wooden door, the room is dimly lit by the soft glow of a fireplace. The house is much smaller than you might expect. There is no soft carpet beneath your feet. No electric lights brighten the corners. No central heating keeps the room warm. Everything feels simple, quiet, and peaceful. The bed itself is nothing like the comfortable mattresses we know today. For many ordinary families, a bed was one of the most valuable possessions they own. Building one required skilled craftsmanship, sturdy wood, and materials that were often expensive. Many people could not even afford a proper bed. Instead, they slept on simple wooden frames filled with straw, dried grass, leaves, or wool. These early mattresses were far from perfect. Over time, the straw would become flat and uncomfortable. Tiny insects sometimes found shelter inside, and families regularly replaced the filling whenever they could. Yet after a full day of farming, cooking, carrying water, or working in the fields, even a straw mattress could feel wonderfully comfortable. Blankets were also precious. A thick wool blanket represented warmth, security, and sometimes even wealth. Poor families often shared only one or two blankets among everyone sleeping in the same room. During the cold winters, family members slept close together, not only for comfort, but also to share body heat. Children slept beside parents. Grandparents often rested nearby. Even visitors might share the same sleeping space. Privacy, as we think of it today, was extremely rare. Sleeping together simply made practical sense. The fireplace slowly burned through the night, filling the room with gentle warmth and the comforting smell of smoke. Outside, the wind quietly moved across empty fields. Inside, breathing slowed. The house became completely silent. Only the occasional crackle of burning wood interrupted the peaceful darkness. For wealthy nobles, however, sleeping looked very different. Their beds were much larger. Heavy wooden frames supported thick feather-filled mattresses that felt incredibly soft compared to straw. Rich curtains surrounded the bed, trapping warmth during freezing nights while also creating a sense of privacy inside enormous stone castles. These curtains served another purpose as well. Castles were surprisingly cold. Even with roaring fireplaces, thick stone walls remained chilly for much of the year. The curtains helped keep precious warmth close to the sleeper. Some noble families even decorated their beds with colorful embroidered fabrics, carefully woven blankets, and beautiful pillows. To visitors, the bed itself became a symbol of status and importance. Yet despite all their wealth, even kings and queens still experience long winter nights. They listen to the same winds outside. They watch the same moon crossing the sky. And they often woke during the quiet hours between their first and second sleep. In many ways, the peaceful rhythm of the night belonged to everyone, whether rich or poor, whether living inside a castle or a tiny wooden cottage. Nighttime invited every person to slow down, to rest, and to quietly prepare for another sunrise. As our gentle journey continues, the fire grows softer, the room becomes warmer, and somewhere outside, The first faint sounds of the sleeping countryside drift peacefully through the darkness. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let history carry you gently into even deeper rest. Now let your imagination carry you away from the small village and toward the tall stone walls of a medieval castle. The night is calm. A cool breeze moves across the courtyard, gently brushing the ancient flags hanging from the towers. Above you, thousands of stars quietly shine across the dark sky. Unlike the peaceful cottages of ordinary villagers, castles never became completely silent. Somewhere in the distance, a guard slowly walks along the stone walls. His footsteps echo softly through the empty corridors. Every few moments he pauses, looks into the darkness, and continues his slow journey. Inside the castle, long hallways are lit by flickering candles. Their golden light dances gently across the cold stone walls, creating long shadows that move almost like silent ghosts. There is no electricity, only the gentle crackling of fireplaces, the soft whisper of the wind, and the occasional creak of old wooden doors. The king has already retired for the evening. His bedroom is much larger than those of ordinary people, but it is far simpler than many people imagine today. The bed is tall and heavy, made from solid oak. Thick curtains surround it, not only for privacy, but also to keep out the cold air that slips through the stone walls. The mattress is stuffed with feathers or straw, depending on wealth. Several wool blankets are carefully folded across the bed. Even inside a castle, winter nights can feel surprisingly cold. Before sleeping, servants quietly enter the room. They add fresh wood to the fireplace. They place warm stones beneath the blankets. They carefully trim the candles before leaving as silently as they arrived. Soon only the gentle sound of the burning fire remains. Elsewhere in the castle, life continues at a slower pace. The castle kitchen is finally empty after preparing food for hundreds of people throughout the day. The cooks have finished their work. The large ovens slowly lose their heat. Wooden tables stand quietly beneath the fading candlelight. In another corner of the castle, monks quietly read handwritten books by candlelight. Each page has been copied by hand. Every letter is written with extraordinary patience. There are no printing presses yet. Every book is precious. Every word is valuable. As midnight approaches, the castle becomes even quieter. Only the guards remain awake. From the highest tower, one guard gazes across the sleeping countryside. Far below, tiny villages rest peacefully beneath the moon. The forests appear almost black. The rivers reflect silver moonlight as they slowly flow through the landscape. Sometimes an owl calls from the trees. Sometimes only complete silence fills the night. People living inside castles often believed that darkness carried many mysteries. Stories of wandering spirits, strange creatures, and unexplained sounds were passed from one generation to another. Whether these stories were true or simply products of imagination, no one could say with certainty. Perhaps that uncertainty made the nights feel even more mysterious. As the fire burns lower, the candles grow dimmer, and the quiet castle settles into peaceful sleep. Allow your own thoughts to become slower, your breathing softer, and your mind lighter. There is nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to do, only the peaceful rhythm of history guiding you gently toward a deep and restful sleep. The castle has become completely quiet. The last candle flickers gently before growing dim. Outside, the cool night air drifts slowly across the fields, carrying only the faint sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Now let us leave the grand halls of the castle and step inside the humble home of an ordinary medieval family. At first glance, the room appears very simple. The walls are made of rough timber and stone. The floor is packed earth, cool beneath bare feet. A small fireplace glows gently in one corner, providing warmth for the entire family. There is no separate bedroom, no soft carpet, no electric light, only the quiet comfort of a peaceful evening. If you looked around the room, you might wonder where everyone sleeps. The answer may surprise you. Most medieval families did not own the large, comfortable beds we enjoy today. Instead, many slept on simple wooden frames filled with straw. Fresh straw was packed tightly into cloth sacks to create a mattress. When the straw was new, it felt surprisingly soft, but over time, it became flat, rough, and uncomfortable. Every few weeks or months, the straw had to be replaced. For poor families, even this was considered a luxury. Some people simply slept on blankets spread across wooden benches, or directly on the floor near the warmth of the fire. Warmth was far more important than comfort. Winter nights in medieval Europe were often bitterly cold. Without central heating, every bit of warmth mattered. Families often slept close together, not only because space was limited, but because sharing body heat helped everyone stay warm until morning. Children usually slept beside their parents. Grandparents sometimes shared the same room. In many homes, several generations rested beneath the same roof. Privacy, as we understand it today, was almost unknown. The blankets themselves were very different from modern ones. Most were woven from thick wool. They were heavy, sometimes rough against the skin, but incredibly warm. Feather-filled blankets were rare and expensive. Only wealthy households could afford such comfort. Pillows were also much simpler. Instead of soft memory foam, people stuffed linen bags with feathers, wool, dried grass, or even pieces of old cloth. Some poorer families had no pillow at all. Instead, they folded a cloak beneath their heads. Even with these simple sleeping arrangements, people often fell asleep quickly. Their days were filled with physical work. Farmers spent long hours in the fields. Blacksmiths stood beside blazing fires. Millers lifted heavy sacks of grain. Women cooked, cleaned, carried water, spun wool, and cared for children from sunrise until sunset. By nightfall, their bodies welcomed rest. The darkness itself encouraged sleep. There were no glowing screens, no television, no late-night notifications, only the slow rhythm of nature. As the fire gradually faded, the room became darker. Outside, the stars continued their silent journey across the sky. The moon cast a gentle silver light through tiny windows. Inside the cottage, every slow breath blended with the quiet sounds of the night. Perhaps somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before settling down again. Perhaps an owl called softly from the forest. Then silence returned, complete, peaceful, and comforting. As you picture this quiet medieval home, allow yourself to imagine lying beneath a thick wool blanket, feeling the warmth of the fading fire, listening only to the gentle sounds of the sleeping world. There is no rush, no schedule waiting for tomorrow, only the calm rhythm of another peaceful medieval night slowly carrying you toward deeper and deeper sleep. The warmth of the fireplace slowly begins to fade. Only a few glowing embers remain, casting a soft orange light across the small wooden room. The family is fast asleep, wrapped in thick wool blankets as the quiet hours of the night continue. Outside, the village rests beneath a sky filled with countless stars. There are no streetlights, no passing cars, no distant engines. Only the gentle sounds of nature. A cool breeze moves softly through the trees, causing the leaves to whisper to one another. Somewhere far away, an owl calls into the darkness. The sound is calm, slow, and familiar. For the people of the Middle Ages, these peaceful nighttime sounds were simply part of everyday life. A dog lets out a single bark before settling down once again. A horse shifts gently inside its stable. From a nearby stream comes the quiet sound of flowing water, continuing its endless journey beneath the moonlight. Without modern cities, the night was incredibly quiet. Many people had never experienced complete silence during the day. But after sunset, the world became wonderfully peaceful. The stars appeared brighter than we can imagine today. Without electric lights filling the sky, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of silver. Children often grew up recognizing the constellations long before they could read. Travelers used the stars to guide their journeys. Farmers watched the moon carefully, believing its cycles influenced the seasons and their crops. As midnight passed, the air became cooler. Mist slowly gathered above the fields. The village seemed almost frozen in time. Inside every small cottage, families rested after long hours of hard work. The fire continued to glow. Breathing remained slow and steady. Dreams quietly filled the darkness. Perhaps someone dreamed of next year's harvest. Perhaps another dreamed of distant cities they would never visit. Or perhaps they simply dreamed of another peaceful morning. As you continue listening, imagine yourself standing beneath that ancient night sky. Feel the cool air upon your face. Listen to the soft wind, the distant owl, the flowing stream, and the quiet rhythm of history itself. Allow every peaceful sound to slow your thoughts, relax your body, and gently carry you toward another deep and restful sleep. As the night grows deeper, only a single candle continues to burn. Its gentle flame dances softly against the stone walls, filling the room with a warm golden glow. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees, while the village sleeps in complete silence. In this peaceful moment, time feels almost forgotten. There is nothing to hurry toward, only the quiet comfort of the night, inviting every tired soul to rest a little longer. The night has now reached its quietest hour. Most of the village is fast asleep, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, while only the faint glow of dying fireplaces remains. Outside, a gentle mist begins to spread across the narrow dirt roads, softening every shadow beneath the pale moonlight. Yet not everyone is asleep. One man slowly walks through the silent streets. He is the village watchman. His duty is simple but important. Throughout the night, he carefully watches over the homes, the barns, and the small wooden gates that protect the village. In one hand, he carries a lantern, its warm light gently swaying with each slow step. In the other, he holds a wooden staff, tapping it softly against the ground as he walks. Tap, pause, tap, pause. For the sleeping villagers, that familiar rhythm brings comfort rather than fear. It means someone is awake while everyone else rests. The watchman knows every corner of the village. He passes the blacksmith's workshop, now silent after a long day's work. He walks beside the bakery, where tomorrow's bread has not yet been prepared. He glances toward the church, whose tall tower disappears into the darkness above. Everything feels peaceful. Occasionally, he stops to look toward the forest beyond the village. The trees stand perfectly still beneath the stars. Some people believe strange creatures wandered those woods after sunset. Others believed the forest was simply another part of nature, beautiful and mysterious in the moonlight. The watchman rarely paid attention to such stories. His greatest concern was much simpler: a forgotten fire, a wandering animal, or a traveler arriving late after sunset. These were the things he expected to find. As he continues his slow walk, the cool night air fills his lungs. Above him, thousands of stars sparkle across the clear medieval sky. Without modern lights, the heavens appear endless. The Milky Way stretches from one horizon to the other like a glowing river of tiny diamonds. For a brief moment, the watchman stops walking. He quietly looks upward. Perhaps he wonders what lies beyond those distant stars. Perhaps he simply enjoys the peaceful silence before continuing his nightly rounds. Soon the eastern horizon begins to grow ever so slightly lighter. Morning is still far away, but another medieval night is slowly coming to an end. For now, the village remains asleep. The lantern continues to glow. The gentle footsteps continue across the silent road, and history quietly whispers its stories, one peaceful night at a time. The night is slowly beginning to change. The stars still shine brightly above the quiet village, but somewhere beyond the distant hills, the first hint of morning is waiting patiently. The air feels colder now, carrying the fresh scent of damp grass and quiet forests. Most people are still asleep. Inside their small wooden cottages, the last glowing embers in the fireplaces continue to give off a gentle warmth. Thick wool blankets rise and fall with every slow breath. Outside, the village remains peaceful. The watchman finishes his final walk through the narrow streets before returning home. His lantern burns lower than before, its golden light growing softer with every passing moment. Nearby, a horse quietly shifts inside its stable. A sheep lets out a gentle sound before becoming still once again. Everything feels calm. Far above, the moon slowly begins its journey toward the western sky. For centuries, people believed these final hours before sunrise held a special kind of silence. It was a time for quiet. The first light of dawn quietly reaches the edge of the village. The sky changes from deep blue to soft shades of gray and pale gold. A gentle mist still rests over the fields, while tiny drops of dew sparkle on the tall grass. The cool morning air feels fresh and peaceful. Inside the cottages, the fire has almost gone out. Only a few glowing embers remain beneath a layer of soft gray ash. The first person to wake slowly kneels beside the fireplace. With careful hands, they place a few small pieces of dry wood onto the warm coals. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, a tiny flame appears. It grows little by little until the room is once again filled with gentle warmth. The soft crackling of burning wood becomes the first sound of the new day. Soon, a small iron pot is placed above the fire. Fresh water begins to warm. Simple porridge made from oats or barley will become breakfast for the family. Sometimes there is a small piece of bread left from the day before. On fortunate mornings, there may even be a little cheese or fresh milk. The smell of warm food slowly fills the room. Outside, more birds begin singing. The village is no longer completely asleep. Smoke rises gently from one chimney after another, floating peacefully into the cool morning sky. A farmer opens his wooden door and quietly steps outside. He stretches his tired muscles before looking across the fields. Another day of work is about to begin. His horses wait patiently inside the stable. His tools rest exactly where he left them the evening before. Everything feels familiar. Everything feels calm. There is no rush. Life follows the same gentle rhythm it has followed for generations. The rising sun slowly brings light to every corner of the village. The stars quietly disappear. The moon fades into the brightening sky. Another peaceful medieval night has come to an end, and with the warmth of the morning fire, a brand new day begins. The sun has not yet climbed high into the sky, but the medieval village is slowly coming to life. A cool morning breeze drifts through the narrow paths between the cottages, carrying the comforting smell of fresh bread and burning firewood. One by one, wooden doors begin to open. Farmers quietly step outside, stretching after a peaceful night's rest. They gather their simple tools and begin walking toward the open fields, where another long day of work awaits. Nearby, chickens wander freely through the village, scratching the ground in search of seeds. A rooster proudly announces the arrival of the morning with a loud crow that echoes across the countryside. Children slowly wake as the warm sunlight enters through the tiny windows. Some help their parents carry water from the village well, while others feed the family animals before breakfast. At the blacksmith's workshop, yesterday's quiet silence is replaced by the sound of iron meeting iron. Clang, clang, clang. The steady rhythm spreads gently through the village. Not far away, the village baker places fresh loaves of bread inside a large stone oven. The rich aroma slowly fills the cool morning air, reminding everyone that a new day has truly begun. The church bell rings softly in the distance. Its peaceful sound reaches every cottage, every field, and every winding path. For many villagers, this gentle bell marks the beginning of another ordinary day. There is comfort in this familiar routine, the same sunrise, the same quiet roads, the same friendly faces. Life moves slowly, following the seasons rather than the clock. As you imagine this peaceful morning, allow your breathing to become slower once again. Feel the gentle warmth of the rising. Part 12, A Walk Through the Medieval Marketplace. As the morning grows brighter, the quiet village slowly becomes more lively. The narrow dirt roads, silent only a short while ago, are now filled with the gentle footsteps of merchants, farmers, and travelers. The fresh morning air carries the pleasant scent of warm bread, dried herbs, and burning oak wood. At the center of the village, the marketplace begins to awaken. Wooden stalls are carefully arranged in neat rows. One merchant lays out colorful baskets filled with apples, onions, and carrots freshly picked from nearby fields. Another displays wheels of cheese, jars of honey, and freshly churned butter. A tailor unfolds simple wool cloaks and linen shirts, hoping today's visitors will find something they. Part 13, A Traveler's Rest. As the afternoon slowly fades, a tired traveler arrives at a small medieval village. His boots are dusty, and his long journey has left him exhausted. Around his shoulders hangs a worn wool cloak, protecting him from the cool evening air. Near the center of the village stands a small roadside inn. A warm fire glows inside, filling the room with gentle light and the comforting smell of fresh bread and vegetable soup. The traveler quietly sits beside the fireplace. He enjoys a simple meal of bread, warm soup, and cool water. After many hours of walking, the humble food feels wonderfully satisfying. As darkness falls, the innkeeper prepares a straw mattress covered with thick wool blankets. It is simple, but warm and peaceful. Before going to bed, the traveler steps outside for one last look at the night sky. Thousands of stars shine brightly above him, while the village rests in complete silence. Taking a slow, peaceful breath, he returns inside, closes his eyes, and drifts into a deep and restful sleep, ready for tomorrow's journey.
As evening settles over the medieval village, the day quietly comes to an end. The last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the hills, and the sky slowly fills with stars. Farmers return home, while warm candlelight begins to glow inside the wooden cottages. The smell of fresh bread drifts through the cool evening air. A gentle breeze moves softly through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl sings into the peaceful night. The village becomes completely still. There is no rush, no noise, only the quiet rhythm of history. Take a slow breath, listen to the peaceful night, and gently drift into a deep, calm, and restful sleep. An old stone castle stands quietly beneath the bright moonlight. A few candles glow softly through its narrow windows, while the last fire gently crackles inside the great hall. Guards slowly walk along the castle walls, watching over the peaceful land. A cool breeze moves through the trees, and thousands of stars shine above. Everything is calm. Everything is still. Take a slow breath, feel the peaceful silence, and gently drift into a deep and restful sleep. As the sun slowly disappears beyond the hills, the forest becomes calm and quiet. Tall oak trees stand beneath the soft moonlight, while a cool breeze gently moves the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls into the peaceful night. A narrow path winds through the ancient woods, untouched by the noise of the busy world. Small animals quietly return to their homes, and the stars begin to shine between the branches above. Everything feels still. Everything feels safe. Take a slow breath, listen to the gentle wind, and let the peaceful forest carry you toward a deep and restful sleep. As the morning sun rises gently over the medieval village, people begin gathering around the old stone well. Women carry wooden buckets, children quietly wait beside their parents, and neighbors exchange warm smiles. The sound of fresh water echoes softly through the peaceful air. For generations, this simple well has been the heart of the village, providing clean water for every family. Nearby, birds sing from the trees while a gentle breeze moves across the fields. Everything feels calm. Everything feels familiar. Take a slow breath, listen to the peaceful sound of flowing water, and allow yourself to drift deeper into comfort, relaxation, and restful sleep. As evening slowly fades, a quiet monastery rests beneath the gentle moonlight. Inside its ancient stone walls, a few monks walk silently through long hallways lit by soft candlelight. The air is peaceful, filled only with the gentle crackle of a small fire and the distant whisper of the wind. One monk quietly opens an old handwritten book and begins to read by the warm glow of a single candle. Outside, the stars shine brightly above the silent hills. Everything feels calm. Everything feels timeless. Take a slow breath, feel the peaceful silence, and gently drift into a deep and restful sleep. The night has become wonderfully quiet. The village is asleep, the castle stands silent, and the forests rest beneath a sky filled with countless stars. A cool breeze drifts gently across the fields, carrying the peaceful scent of pine trees and fresh earth. The moon shines softly, lighting the narrow paths with a silver glow. There is nothing to disturb the silence, only the gentle whisper of the wind, the distant sound of an owl, and the calm rhythm of another peaceful medieval night. Take one slow breath, close your eyes, and let the quiet beauty of this ancient world guide you into a deep, peaceful sleep. The journey through the medieval world now comes to a peaceful end. The village sleeps quietly beneath the glowing moon. The castle rests in silence. The forests whisper gently in the cool night breeze, and the stars continue their endless dance across the sky. Every path is still, every home is peaceful, every soul is resting, As the fire slowly fades and the last candle grows dim, the night becomes softer than ever before. Thank you for joining this quiet journey through history. Now, let your breathing become slow and gentle. Feel your body relax, close your eyes, and drift peacefully into a deep, comfortable, and restful sleep. Good night, and may peaceful dreams stay with you until morning.
Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most charming little pandemics in human history, the Black Death, a delightful 14th century event that combined poor hygiene, terrible medical advice, and fleas with an attitude problem. Tonight we ask, what could you have done to make it out alive? And no, just don't get sick, doesn't count. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with your first and probably most important life choice. Where are you living? If you said a bustling 14th century city full of opportunity and culture, congratulations, you're already 85% dead. Cities during the Black Plague were not charming medieval postcards. They were overpopulated, unwashed, and alarmingly enthusiastic about throwing waste into the streets. Imagine thousands of people crammed together in wooden buildings with no plumbing, no sanitation, and rats so comfortable they probably paid rent. Urban centres like London, Paris and Florence were the plague's all-you-can-eat buffet. Close quarters? Check. Open gutters? Check. Livestock living indoors? You bet. The cities were a hotbed of human contact, pest activity, and very bad smells. If airborne pathogens didn't get you, the psychological trauma of daily smells probably would. You didn't even need to be sick, just near someone who was. Markets, churches, bathhouses, on the rare occasion they were open, and inns packed people into tight spaces. Fleas loved it, rats thrived, and you, the innocent city dweller just trying to buy onions, were one bite away from a full-body breakdown. Now contrast this with the countryside. Yes, it had its downsides, like isolation, weather, and the occasional angry goose, but crucially, it had space. You had fewer neighbours, fewer crowds, and significantly fewer rats per square foot. If you lived on a farm or in a sleepy village up a hill where the nearest human lived 2 goat lengths away, your chances of survival were dramatically better. Even better, remote monasteries. Some religious orders, like the Carthusians, practiced near total silence and isolation. Their lifestyle wasn't designed for plague survival, but it just happened to be the medieval equivalent of an elite quarantine bubble. In short, if you valued your lungs, your blood, and your continued existence, the best move in 1348 was to get as far away from people as legally or illegally possible. Cancel your trips, leave the market early, and if anyone says, "It's probably not that bad," that's your cue to grab your cloak and leave the city immediately. Imagine this. It's 1349. Someone sneezes in your general direction. Do you A. politely ask if they're okay, B. offer them a clove of garlic, or C. run like your life depends on it? Because it does? Correct answer, C. Always C. Back then, no one knew what a virus was, but they did understand one thing. If someone near you started sweating, coughing, or bleeding from strange places, it was time to become a recluse. Social distancing didn't have a catchy name yet, but the survivors practiced it religiously. Plague was thought to be spread by bad air, also known as miasma. This wasn't completely accurate. It was the fleas, not the fog. But avoiding other humans who reeked of decay? accidentally excellent advice. People who withdrew early, to the countryside, to a family cottage, to anywhere that wasn't full of suspicious coughing, had much better odds of making it out alive. Entire families survived by simply closing the door and not opening it until the next year. Did it strain relationships? Absolutely. Was it awkward when your cousin came knocking, begging for soup and sneezing through the keyhole? Extremely. But letting them in could mean you'd all be dead by Sunday. So, no soup for Cousin Gregory. Some nobles and wealthy families even fled their cities at the first sign of plague. The wealthy Boccaccio family, for example, packed up and left Florence, social distancing with wine, poetry, and zero peasant contact. Smart. Meanwhile, the less fortunate learned to self-isolate through trial and error. Mostly error. Markets, festivals, weddings. Any large gathering was a game of microbiological roulette. If you had the willpower to skip them, stay home, and talk to your cat instead of your neighbour, you had a real shot at outliving the pandemic. It's simple. Every interaction was a potential death sentence. And while medieval people didn't have Twitter threads about flattening the curve, they did figure out very quickly that fewer handshakes meant more birthdays. If you were lucky enough to survive the Black Plague, chances are you weren't doing it in velvet. Let's talk fashion. Specifically, how your wardrobe could get you killed in 1348. The medieval upper class loved long, flowing robes, fur-trimmed sleeves, and thick, ornate fabrics that said, "I have money," and "I definitely don't plan on fleeing quickly." But to fleas, that wasn't style. That was prime real estate. The plague wasn't picky. Rich or poor, if you had fabric and skin, you were fair game. But the richer you were, the more layers you wore, and the more space you gave fleas to move in, settle down, and start a small family. In this way, your fashion sense could function like a hotel chain for parasites. What did work? Simplicity. Survivors tended to wear shorter tunics, less fabric, tighter sleeves, and linen, the one fabric that fleas weren't writing love letters about. Bonus points if you washed your clothes more than once a season, which, yes, was considered excessive by medieval standards. Some communities went as far as burning entire wardrobes, thinking the disease clung to cloth. This wasn't entirely wrong. Fleas can survive for days without a host and happily hitch a ride on your favourite overcoat. That velvet cloak with the squirrel fur trim. It's not a flex if it's also carrying microscopic death. People also wore accessories, lots of them, but the beaded necklaces, perfumes and rosemary bundles weren't doing much to stop the plague. Unless you counted offending everyone's noses into keeping their distance, in which case, bravo. And if you're wondering about armour, no, it didn't help either. You couldn't sword fight the plague. Though dying in full plate because you refused to remove your gauntlets long enough to wash your hands would be very on brand for certain knights. If you were hoping to outlive the Black Plague, geography was more than just scenic. It could literally save your skin, especially if that skin was far, far uphill. Medieval science had gaps. They didn't know what bacteria were, but they did notice patterns, like how people living on hills didn't drop dead quite as fast as those in swampy lowlands. Coincidence? Maybe. But if your neighbour's corpse just fell over the fence, you probably weren't sticking around to demand peer-reviewed studies. Elevation had a few sneaky advantages. First, rats, the little death chariots of the plague, hated climbing. Or rather, they hated staying at elevation, especially where food was scarce and temperatures dropped. The colder the hill, the less likely you were to host a flea festival. Second, wind. Higher ground meant better air circulation. And while bad air or miasma wasn't the direct cause of the plague, fleeing stagnant, putrid-smelling alleys for crisp hilltop breezes, that was a good call anyway. At the very least, it spared you the aroma of medieval city life, a blend of human waste, goat hair, and desperation. Hills also came with the luxury of fewer people. That's right, elevation plus isolation. A winning combo in any century. The plague couldn't spread if there was no one to catch it, and no one to breathe on you in line at the communal water barrel. Some monasteries and manors were already built on high ground, not for plague reasons, but because they liked the view and hated being invaded. But when the Black Death rolled through, those foundations suddenly felt visionary. You didn't need to be rich to head uphill. Even shepherds, goat herds, and that one guy who talked to birds had the right idea. Fresh air, no neighbours, and a steep walk deterring both the plague and surprise visits. And if someone from the valley came trudging up with a cough and a story about how they think it's just a cold, you had a valid excuse to roll a barrel downhill at them in self-defence. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval people were not famous for their love of soap, or water, or personal boundaries. By the 14th century, the great bathing renaissance had hit a rough patch. Earlier medieval periods had public bathhouses, some quite elaborate. But by the time the Black Death arrived, bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. Medical experts, and I use that term generously, believed that hot water opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to disease. In other words, washing made you more likely to die. This, of course, was the opposite of true. Plague-carrying fleas loved dirty, unwashed skin, especially the kind of skin buried under 3 layers of wool and last month's stew. People who bathed, even infrequently, were less attractive to parasites. They didn't know this, of course. They just thought they were unlucky enough to smell like sin. Turns out, sin smelled like survival. Soap existed, but it was either homemade, from ashes and animal fat, or absurdly expensive. Still, some survivors washed their hands and faces regularly, even if it was more superstition than science. Others bathed with herbs, vinegar, or wine, which was less effective but did make you smell like a salad someone prayed over. Clothes were another problem. Laundry was done maybe once a month, if you were rich, and typically involved beating your garments against a rock and hoping the lice took the hint. Those who took the time to boil their linens or change outfits weekly, not exactly clean by today's standards, but positively sterile by plague-era benchmarks. And let's not forget dental hygiene. Toothpaste didn't exist, but chewing mint leaves or rubbing salt on your teeth was a thing. Again, it didn't cure the plague, but it did make your deathbed conversations slightly more tolerable. So, could a bath save your life? Not directly, but it drastically reduced your chances of turning into a mobile flea banquet. Plus, it separated you from the crowd. Literally. People avoided you because you smelled weirdly clean. Ah, medieval doctors. Men of great confidence, questionable hygiene, and even worse theories. If you found yourself getting a bit plaguey in 1349 and decided, "I'd better call a doctor," congratulations. You've just made your final mistake. To be fair, they were doing their best with what little they understood, which was nothing. The leading theory of the time was the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant your humours were out of balance. The solution? Drain something. Usually blood, occasionally dignity. So you'd show up coughing blood, and they'd respond by sticking leeches on you until you looked like a deflated wineskin. Or worse, they'd slice open a vein to let the bad out, which had the side effect of also letting you out. Then there were the plague doctors, dressed in their iconic bird-beaked masks stuffed with flowers, herbs and spices. The beak wasn't a fashion statement. It was their primitive version of PPE. They thought good smells warded off bad air, which wasn't totally wrong. If you define working as keeping you too dizzy to notice the smell of rotting bodies. Their tools? Wooden sticks for poking at a safe distance, a cane for nudging you into a mass grave if things didn't go well, and a whole lot of sage burning. Treatment options were equally grim. Rubbing onions on your armpits, drinking crushed emeralds, carrying a dead toad in a bag around your neck, sitting in smoke-filled rooms. In other words, if it sounded stupid, painful, or highly flammable, it was probably prescribed. Ironically, the people who fared best were often the ones who avoided medical attention altogether, like nuns, midwives, and herbalists, who stuck to basic hygiene, clean bandages, and staying calm. In the midst of the Black Plague, when cities turned into open-air morgues and doctors prescribed onions for everything short of decapitation, one group quietly outperformed everyone in the survival game: monks. But not just any monks. We're talking about the stay-at-home, vow of silence type. Think Carthusians, not travelling friars with pockets full of fleas. Why did monastic life offer such plague-proof potential? For starters, monasteries were often isolated, perched on hillsides or nestled in rural nowhere. They were designed for prayer and reflection, not traffic, festivals, or overcrowded inns with that one guy coughing into his soup. Then there were the rules. Monastic life wasn't a free-for-all. It came with structure, scheduled meals, strict sanitation, by medieval standards, and a suspicious lack of hand-holding. Shared utensils? Not likely. Hugging? Spiritually discouraged. Group bathhouse orgies? Absolutely not. They also had access to food and clean water, a huge bonus when much of the population was too sick to farm or boil a pot. Monasteries stored grain, grew their own herbs, and most importantly, didn't rely on urban markets swarming with rats and regret. Oh, and did we mention they were celibate? Which meant no late-night visits to plaguey tavern wenches. Just you, your thoughts, and the occasional Latin chant to keep you company. Now, not all monks made it out alive. Some, bless them, chose to act as caregivers. They ventured into cities to help the sick. Noble, yes, but statistically inadvisable. Travelling clergy had the worst of both worlds: exposure to dying strangers and the inability to run away because it would have looked bad in the Bible. So, if you were going the monk route, your best bet was to join early, stay put, and say no to missions. Of course, you didn't have to be a monk to benefit from the monk lifestyle. You just needed to copy their habits, live in the middle of nowhere, grow your own food, limit contact with in the Black Death economy. Certain jobs came with a special bonus: immediate exposure to everyone's germs. Let's start with messengers. Their job was to ride between towns carrying letters, proclamations, or ominous royal decrees no one wanted to hear. Great cardio, terrible survival odds. Every time a messenger dismounted and handed over a scroll, they were essentially swapping paper and plague with whoever had just sneezed on the last delivery. Then there were merchants, the Uber Eats of the 14th century, minus hygiene and customer satisfaction. Merchants travelled between cities, markets, and ports, bringing spices, cloth, and fleas from one contaminated location to the next. They were plague super-spreaders, before super-spreading had a name. If you worked these gigs, you were the human equivalent of a courier pigeon with a death wish. So what jobs did give you a better shot? Blacksmiths, bakers, shepherds, and millers, people who worked with fire, grain, or animals, and mostly kept to themselves. These folks didn't need to travel far. They didn't have to shake hands with strangers or enter plague-saturated cities for meetings that could have been parchment scrolls. Then there were grave diggers. Morbid, yes, but oddly secure. The job wasn't plague-proof, but they had better tools, like gloves, shovels, and the highly underrated strategy of not touching things with your face. Some even learned to recognize early plague signs and took great pride in not dying like everyone else around them. If you were really lucky, you could be a recluse, hermit, or mildly disliked goat herder. Solitary work was suddenly in vogue. Your antisocial behavior, rebranded as wise pandemic planning. Even artisans like cobblers and weavers fared decently. They worked from home, took limited clients, and could pretend they were just booked when someone sketchy knocked on the door, coughing and asking for shoes. In 1349, the fewer errands you ran, the longer you lived. Let's get one thing straight. In Plague-era Europe, rats weren't just background noise. They were main characters, hairy, twitchy, plague chariot-riding villains in your everyday life. And they had one mission: get into your food and leave you with a parting gift called Yersinia pestis. If you wanted to survive the Black Death, one of the smartest things you could do, besides running uphill and avoiding humans, was to elevate your pantry, literally. Grain bins on the floor? That's a rat rave waiting to happen. Open baskets of bread under your bed? Congratulations, you've opened a plague-themed buffet. Rats weren't picky eaters, and neither were their fleas. The moment rodents set up shop in your pantry, your odds of living past Lent dropped faster than your grain reserves. Now, some medieval households wised up. They stored food on high wooden shelves, in ceramic jars, or inside suspended boxes hanging from the ceiling like weird piñatas that no one was allowed to hit. These weren't fancy design choices. They were desperate attempts to keep the plague at tail's length. And then there were cats, the underappreciated MVPs of rodent control. The more felines you had prowling your kitchen, the better. Unfortunately, some places accused cats of being witches' familiars and killed them, which, spoiler alert, made the rat problem much worse. It's hard to survive when you've just executed your only line of defense. Also, let's talk about your trash. Throwing scraps out the window wasn't just rude, it was rat bait. The same went for leaving compost heaps next to your house like some kind of rodent Airbnb. Smart survivors moved their waste far from their living quarters, preferably into someone else's yard. It's worth noting that rats didn't technically cause the plague, their fleas did. But fleas don't travel long distances on their own. When disaster strikes, people tend to respond in one of two ways: calmly seeking rational solutions, or joining a screaming, torch-wielding mob convinced it's all the neighbours' fault. Guess which one was more popular in 1348? The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it shattered brains. And with no germ theory, microscopes, or decent leadership, folks were left to invent explanations. Many of them sounded like, "It must be them," followed by pitchforks, torches, and wildly misdirected violence. In some towns, mobs accused outsiders, Jews, foreigners, and basically anyone who looked like they hadn't sneezed recently. People believed wells were being poisoned, that the plague was punishment from God, that a local widow with too many cats had caused all this with her suspicious herbal teas. Spoiler, none of it helped. In fact, mob behaviour usually made things worse. You'd gather a large group of already paranoid people, shout over each other about how he coughed near my cow, and then storm the victim's home to... what? Solve the plague by burning it down? Smart. Real smart. Worse still, Mobs brought people together, physically, huddled in sweaty crowds, yelling and swapping bacteria like they were trading Pokemon cards. You didn't just risk making a moral mistake, you also risked contracting the very disease you were trying to blame on someone else. The people who actually survived the Black Death were often the ones who kept a low profile. Not because they were cowards, but because they weren't interested in collective panic rituals. While the mob was busy dragging an astrologer out of town for reading stars, too confidently, survivors were boarding up their windows, boiling water, and quietly not dying. There's a lesson here. Panic spreads faster than plague, and angry crowds are rarely wise problem solvers. Unless you enjoy the smell of smoke, moral failure, and a guaranteed exposure to cough droplets, maybe don't grab the torch. Because in a pandemic, the only thing more contagious than disease is ignorance at scale. Ah, garlic, nature's breath mint, seasoning staple, and medieval body spray of choice. When the plague arrived, people didn't have vaccines, antibiotics, or even a firm grasp on what a germ was. What they did have was garlic, and they used it for everything, ate it raw, hung it over their doors, wore it around their necks like cloves of aromatic defiance. Was it scientifically effective? Let's be honest, not really. But in a world where your other options included bathing in vinegar, drinking molten gold, or letting someone drill a hole in your skull to release the bad air, garlic was relatively reasonable. Why garlic? For one, it smelled strong, and that was a big deal. The leading theory of disease at the time was miasma, or bad air. So if you could overpower the smell of rotting corpses and human waste with something aggressively herbal, people figured you were on the path to health. Garlic was the Axe body spray of 1348. But there's a twist. Garlic is a mild antibacterial and insect repellent. Modern science confirms that it does, in fact, have some antimicrobial properties. So while medieval folks didn't know what they were doing, they may have accidentally made themselves less appealing to fleas, the actual plague carriers. That said, don't give garlic too much credit. It wasn't a magical shield. You couldn't rub a clove on your forehead and walk through a corpse pile unscathed. Some people ate so much garlic they became socially unapproachable, which, ironically, did help with social distancing. Also, garlic didn't work if you were still doing everything else wrong. Wearing flea-riddled robes, visiting sick neighbours, drinking from shared cups at a crowded funeral feast. All the garlic in the world wouldn't save you. You'd just die extra seasoned. In the 14th century, the ability to smell something pleasant, like roses, wasn't just a charming sensory experience. It was basically a diagnostic tool. If your nose still worked, congratulations. You probably weren't dead yet. The logic was simple. The plague often hit hard and fast, bringing along symptoms like fever, vomiting, swelling, and, crucially, a sudden loss of the will to stand. One particularly disturbing sign was the onset of overwhelming stench, both from the sick person and the surrounding city. If you could smell flowers instead of rotting flesh, you were already ahead of the game. This is where the posy came in. People of means, or even just good instincts, carried little bouquets of herbs and flowers called pomanders or nosegays. These weren't romantic gestures. They were DIY gas masks made of lavender, mint, sage, and rose petals. You'd carry one in hand, stuff it in your sleeve, or just glue it to your face like a desperate Renaissance party favour. Was this effective? Technically, no. But symbolically, it worked wonders. Walking around with a floral sachet made you look like you were trying, which, during the plague, put you ahead of roughly half the population. The reasoning was again tied to miasma theory. the idea that foul smells carried disease. So naturally, if you could overpower the stench with roses, you were cleansing the air. In practice, you were just giving yourself something to focus on that wasn't death. Plus, the people who used flowers and herbs often had the means to isolate, wash occasionally, and avoid the worst-hit areas. So it wasn't the roses themselves, it was the lifestyle that came with them. Rose sniffers tended to avoid cesspits and street feasts. Also, people kept flowers in the home, burned incense, and simmered herbs on coals. Not because they were aromatherapists, but because living with 10 people in a one-room hut needed some kind of vibe adjustment, which frankly may have saved your life. Let's face it, the plague wasn't just a test of immunity, it was a test of your social calendar. In a time when human contact was roughly as safe as licking a dagger, friendship became inconvenient. Every hug, handshake, or shared mug was a game of bacterial roulette. And the people with the best odds, the ones who politely declined all invitations forever. Medieval survivors were often those who lived quiet, uneventful lives. Not because they were insightful virologists, but because they just didn't like people that much to begin with. In short, introverts thrived. That one neighbour who always said, "I'll come by later," and never did. Alive. The couple who skipped every market fair, wedding feast and Saints' Day party. Also alive. The guy who muttered to his chickens and lived in a shed. Weird, but alive. The more friends you had, the more chances the plague had to hitch a ride into your home. Even kind gestures were dangerous. Offering bread to a sick neighbour? Risky. Visiting your aunt to check in? Deadly. Group prayer circles? Holy, but highly contagious. Many survivors limited their contact to just a few close family members. And even that came with rules. Eat separately, avoid suspicious coughing, and if necessary, build 2 houses and shout between windows. If someone sneezed, that was the medieval equivalent of being unfriended for life. It wasn't personal, it was survival math. Even monasteries and noble households practiced early forms of quarantine. If one person showed symptoms, they were sent to a different wing, or, if you were poor, just told to go lie in the barn and we'll see. Here's the part no one likes to admit. Sometimes, surviving the Black Death came down to dumb luck. Good choices helped, sure. Washing occasionally, avoiding festivals, not licking strangers. But even if you did everything right, a single flea with an attitude could ruin your whole life. That said, the odds really improved if you also happened to be extremely boring. Because excitement in the 14th century often involved people, movement, noise, and very bad decisions. It was the extroverts, the wanderers, the just popping into town crowd who tended to get invited to funerals they didn't realize were their own. Survivors, they leaned into monotony. The plague didn't care how charismatic you were. It didn't care about your ambitions, your side hustle, or your dream to open a tavern in Bruges. It cared if you were within biting range. So the guy who spent his days tending beets and muttering about the weather, immune? No. But invisible to danger? Almost. There were also genetic flukes. Modern scientists believe some people carried mutations, like the CCR5D32 gene, that made them more resistant to the plague's effects. They didn't know that at the time, of course. They just thought, weird that I'm not bleeding from my armpits like everyone else. So yes, if you were genetically fortunate, living alone, mildly antisocial, fond of boiled water, and unreasonably attached to your cat, congratulations. You were medieval elite. But the moment you got creative, tried a new city, invited friends over, joined a flagellant parade, or drank from that mysterious shared chalice at the market, the odds turned. Boring meant routine. Routine meant fewer surprises. And fewer surprises meant fewer unexplained rashes and less spontaneous organ failure. If you made it through the coughing, the bleeding, the rotting streets, and the awkwardly aggressive garlic breath, congratulations. You've officially entered plague survivor territory. And now, you face your final task. Make sure someone knows you were here. Because surviving the Black Death wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about being remembered for it. Enter the scribes, the monks, the diary keepers, and the slightly traumatized villagers with a good memory and access to parchment. These were the real MVPs. Not only did they outlive everyone, they also had the energy to write about it. People like Giovanni Boccaccio, who gave us the Decameron, a book about wealthy Florentines hiding from the plague by telling stories in the countryside. Or that one monk in Yorkshire who scribbled in the margins, "A great pestilence came and many died." Minimalist but effective. Writing things down was more than just catharsis. It was a way to process what had happened, to pass on warnings, and to gently humble-brag about your immune system. Survivors who recorded their stories shaped how future generations understood the plague. And in doing so, they turned not dying into a sort of legacy project. But here's the catch. You had to outlive the printing deadline. That meant staying cautious even after the worst had passed. Many let their guard down too soon. They celebrated, reunited, hosted extremely premature feasts, and then died in the second wave. So if you truly wanted to make it to the end and write your story, don't rush back to town. Don't hug anyone just because the bishop said the plague is probably over. Don't accept free ale from a man with visible boils. Instead, wait. Stay boring. Keep your diary nearby. Observe. And when it was safe, really safe, pick up a quill and record your tale. Maybe no one would read it. Maybe it would moulder in a dusty chest. But maybe, just maybe, some future historian would stumble across it and say, this one knew what they were doing. Because surviving a pandemic is impressive. But surviving it with receipts, that's eternal. Long before psychiatry had a name, mental illness was seen not as a medical condition, but a divine message, or a curse. In ancient Mesopotamia, if someone experienced hallucinations, spoke incoherently, or acted erratically, the first assumption wasn't madness. It was possession. The Sumerians believed that evil spirits could enter the human body and take control. A disturbed mind meant that a demon had claimed the soul. The earliest recorded treatments were not based on logic or science. Instead, they combined ritual, prayer, and magic. Clay tablets from Assyria described detailed incantations designed to drive out the spiritual invader. Exorcists were more trusted than doctors. These weren't obscure fringe beliefs. They were mainstream diagnostics. In ancient Egypt, things weren't much different. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, records both physiological and spiritual explanations for strange behaviors. If you wept without cause, forgot your own name, or withdrew from others, you might have a wandering womb or be cursed by a god. Treatment? Aromatherapy, ritual purification, and appeals to divine intervention. They believed that the heart was the seat of thought, not the brain. But the Greeks took things to another level. In Homeric epics, madness is often the work of gods. Ajax slaughtering sheep thinking they were his enemies? A direct result of divine interference. The concept of divine madness became so embedded in Greek culture that it was sometimes seen as a form of inspiration. Plato even argued that some forms of madness were gifts from the gods, leading to prophecy, artistic genius, or poetic insight. Poets weren't mad, they were chosen. Yet it wasn't all spiritual. Hippocrates, often considered the father of modern medicine, offered a more physical explanation. He blamed imbalances in the four bodily humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Melancholia, what we might now call depression, was an excess of black bile. His solutions: diet, rest, and lifestyle changes. Not bad for a man born in 460 BCE. This duality, spiritual versus physical, would define how societies viewed mental illness for centuries. A person could be cursed or chemically imbalanced, a prophet or a lunatic. The line between healer and priest was razor thin. And depending on where you lived, the voices in your head could either earn you a temple or a burial. In medieval Europe, mental illness lost whatever grace it had under the Greeks. Gone were the philosophical debates about divine inspiration or humoral imbalance. Instead, the church stepped in, and with it came fire, brimstone, and fear. If you were hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there, the likely conclusion wasn't a humoral imbalance. It was sin, or worse, Satan himself. Madness was now framed through a religious lens. The mentally ill were often viewed as morally corrupt, spiritually weak, or possessed by demons. The devil was the prime suspect. A peasant woman wandering the streets in rags, muttering to herself, might be seen as a witch. A nobleman weeping for days without cause could be accused of harbouring unconfessed sin. Confession, flagellation, and prayer were considered viable treatments. Physicians deferred to priests. The institutions of the time didn't fare any better. There were few dedicated places for the mentally ill. Most were left to wander the countryside, survive in dungeons, or rot in overcrowded monasteries. In some towns, they were chained in public squares for their own safety, where locals could poke them with sticks or throw coins at them for amusement. Madness became entertainment. Then came Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam. Founded in the 13th century, it was one of the first institutions to house the mentally disturbed. But house is putting it politely. Bedlam quickly devolved into a human zoo. Visitors would pay admission to gape at the lunatics chained to walls or howling behind barred windows. Treatments included cold water dunkings, bleeding, purging, and whipping. The theory was simple: drive the devil out by force. And yet, amidst the horror, some faint sparks of humanity appeared. Some monks offered kindness and shelter. Islamic physicians like Avicenna, operating far from the Inquisition's grip, still promoted humoral theory and gentle care. In Moorish Spain, hospitals treated the mentally ill with music therapy and fresh air. But in Christendom, mercy was rare and ignorance ruled. Madness was a word soaked in dread. You didn't get help. You got chained. You didn't find healing. You found exile. For most medieval sufferers, the world offered little more than a dungeon, a priest, and prayers that no one was listening to. The age of madness had begun, and it would take centuries before compassion caught up. The Renaissance is often romanticized as a period of rediscovery, of beauty, science, and human potential. But for those suffering from mental illness, the shift was more complicated than hopeful. As classical knowledge resurfaced, so too did older medical ideas, especially from Hippocrates and Galen. The Church's grip loosened slightly. and for a moment, madness was allowed to have a body again, not just a soul. Physicians began to reframe mental illness through anatomy and imbalance rather than sin and demons. Melancholia, hysteria, mania, these became recognizable terms again, treated, at least in theory, with diet, exercise, and calm surroundings. There was even a renewed interest in astrology, with the stars sometimes blamed for emotional instability. A moody temperament? Maybe Saturn was in the wrong house. But don't mistake this for kindness. The Renaissance mind was still deeply suspicious of what it couldn't quantify, and the body, still subject to cleansing. Bloodletting remained popular. So did induced vomiting. If someone was too agitated, they might be restrained for days or subjected to spinning chairs designed to reset the brain. In Italy and France, asylums grew more common, not out of compassion, but to protect society from the unpredictables. One notable voice stood out, Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician. In the mid-1500s, Weyer dared to claim that many so-called witches were simply mentally ill women in need of care, not execution. He wrote De Praestigiis Daemonum on the tricks of demons, arguing against the witch trials and defending the mad from the wrath of both church and mob. Unsurprisingly, the church was not thrilled. His books were banned, and his ideas largely ignored. Meanwhile, madness remained a useful tool for those in power. Unwanted wives, political rivals, or rebellious daughters could be quietly declared insane and locked away. No trial, no scandal, just a convenient diagnosis. Mental illness was as much a social weapon as a medical mystery. Art and literature, however, blossomed with depictions of madness. Think Ophelia's drowning grief. Think Don Quixote tilting at windmills. The madman became a tragic, almost romantic figure, broken by the world, lost in illusion. But society still didn't know how to help them. The Renaissance reopened the body and reignited the mind, but the soul of psychiatric care still shackled. And the age of enlightenment was about to make that contradiction even sharper. The Enlightenment promised reason, progress, and the triumph of science over superstition. But when it came to mental illness, the results were mixed. On one hand, the idea of locking someone up for being possessed lost credibility. On the other, society now needed a new excuse to marginalize the mentally ill, preferably one with a white coat and a Latin vocabulary. The asylum, once a rare curiosity, became a booming institution. In London, Paris, and Vienna, grand buildings were constructed, far from the city centres, where the insane could be hidden. These places weren't hospitals, they were warehouses, overflowing, understaffed, and reeking of neglect. They were designed less for treatment and more for isolation. The mentally ill were removed from public life like broken furniture from a showroom floor. Ironically, this was framed as progress. French physician Philippe Pinel famously ordered the chains removed from inmates at the Bicêtre Asylum in 1793, a gesture widely hailed as revolutionary. But while symbolic, the reality was less idealistic. Patients might be unshackled, but they were still locked in, subjected to ice baths, forced feeding, and moral therapy, which often meant long lectures about proper behaviour delivered by a stern-faced doctor with a stick. Moral treatment became the buzzword. The idea was that mental illness stemmed from bad habits, laziness, or moral failings. So what was the cure? Discipline, order, routine, no outbursts, no questioning. Think of it as a psychological boot camp with locked doors. Inmates were taught to follow rules, attend chapel, make their beds, and smile at authority. Compliance was considered recovery. In Britain, the York Retreat emerged as a gentler model. Run by Quakers, it emphasised kindness, silence, and natural surroundings. Patients walked in gardens and were treated with respect. This humane model influenced others but remained the exception, not the rule. The real shift came in paperwork. For the first time, doctors began keeping detailed notes on mental patients, charting symptoms, behaviours, and even treatment outcomes. Psychiatry was inching toward being a formal science, though it still relied heavily on guesswork and anecdote. The Enlightenment made mental illness a subject of study instead of shame. But the cost was cold sterility. In its rush to rationalize everything, society reduced the mentally ill to specimens. Less demonic, yes, but still dehumanized. And on the horizon loomed a Victorian world obsessed with propriety, and terrified of what lurked in the human mind. The Victorian era was the golden age of contradictions, elegance and repression, scientific breakthroughs and moral panic. And nowhere were those contradictions more glaring than in how the Victorians dealt with mental illness. For a society obsessed with appearances, madness was a terrifying crack in the porcelain. For women, that crack had a name: hysteria. Derived from the Greek word for uterus, the diagnosis became a catch-all explanation for anything women did that made men uncomfortable. Mood swings, hysteria, sexual desire, hysteria, not wanting to marry. You guessed it, hysteria. It was a patriarchal dream. Pathologize independence, punish emotional expression, and call it science. The treatments were even more absurd. Some doctors recommended vibratory therapy, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like. Others suggested marriage, childbirth, or bed rest. Dr. Weir Mitchell's infamous rest cure confined women to their beds for weeks. No reading, no conversation, no writing. Essentially, mental solitary confinement with wallpaper. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper was a direct response, written after she nearly lost her mind under the same prescription. Meanwhile, in the male-dominated world of medicine, things got weirder. Jean-Martin Charcot, a neurologist in Paris, became famous for his dramatic demonstrations of hypnotized hysterics at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Crowds of male students and elite socialites gathered to watch women twitch and convulse on command. It was half science, half theatre. Charcot believed he was advancing neurology. Critics called it exploitation. Sigmund Freud sat in those audiences, taking notes that would birth psychoanalysis years later. Victorian asylums became vast complexes, often surrounded by high walls and whispering trees. They were supposed to be places of healing, but too often they were dumping grounds for inconvenient people: epileptics, alcoholics, rebellious daughters, elderly parents, or those simply suffering from grief. Once admitted, escape was nearly impossible. A single signature could have you institutionalized. Getting out, that required several more, and luck. The public, meanwhile, kept up appearances. Madness became something to hide, not confront. Families lied about missing relatives. Obituaries omitted institutional deaths. Mental illness was a stain, a scandal, a threat to marriage prospects. The asylum was society's broom closet, and the goal wasn't treatment. It was invisibility. Victorian England perfected the art of hiding what it feared most. And buried beneath the corsets and canes was a nation quietly drowning in untreated minds. The 20th century began with bullets and barbed wire, and it forced the world to finally confront the mental toll of human suffering. During World War I, doctors were faced with something they couldn't exorcise, bleed, or hypnotize away. Men shaking uncontrollably, screaming at phantom gunfire, or rendered mute by terror. These weren't weaklings or madmen. These were soldiers, heroes, broken by war. They called it shell shock. At first, the term was taken literally. Physicians assumed exploding artillery shells were damaging the brain with vibrations. But the real truth was harder to accept. The human mind had a limit. Trench warfare, with its ceaseless bombardment, death, and mud-choked claustrophobia, had broken it. Officers who once laughed at nervous complaints now faced entire battalions suffering from amnesia, tremors, and night terrors. Some men couldn't walk. Others forgot their names. A few simply stared into space for days, unreachable. And yet, many commanders treated it as cowardice. Some British soldiers were executed for desertion, men who had, in fact, been driven insane by trauma. But slowly, attitudes shifted. Doctors like Rivers at Craig Lockhart War Hospital began experimenting with new treatments, talking, writing, and empathetic listening. Rivers famously treated poet Siegfried Sassoon, encouraging him to express his trauma through verse. This was a quiet revolution. For the first time, mental illness wasn't framed as sin or weakness. It was a wound. After the war, shell shock became one of the most controversial terms in psychiatry. Some doctors tried to distance themselves from it, calling it a catch-all for everything from PTSD to malingering. Others recognized it as the birth of trauma psychology. But the public didn't forget. The war neuroses haunted the cultural imagination, broken soldiers shuffling through post-war Europe, eyes sunken, minds far from home. And when World War II arrived, the medical community was better prepared. This time, the term was combat fatigue, and treatment was faster, more humane, though stigma remained. Shell shock opened a new chapter. Mental illness was no longer just for women labelled hysterical or eccentrics in asylums. It could strike the strongest men. It could be earned through service and sacrifice. And that terrified people. Because if war heroes could break, then maybe no one was truly safe from the battlefield inside the mind. As the world stumbled into the mid-20th century, psychiatry took a bold, and often brutal, leap into physical intervention. The idea was simple. If the mind was sick, perhaps the brain could be fixed directly. But fix is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. What followed was a wave of invasive procedures that promised miracles, but often delivered silence, obedience, or ruin. Enter the lobotomy. Developed by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in the 1930s, the procedure involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex to reduce agitation and delusions. It earned Moniz a Nobel Prize. But the real boom came when American psychiatrist Walter Freeman introduced the ice pick lobotomy. No operating room needed, just a mallet and a few minutes behind the eye socket. It was fast, cheap, and horrifying. Tens of thousands underwent the procedure in the US alone, including children, housewives, and veterans. Some became docile. Others lost speech, motor function, or personality entirely. A few died on the table, yet hospitals kept offering it, because it emptied beds. A patient who had been violent or uncooperative was now quiet, vacant, manageable. Success by 1940s standards. Then came electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. While still used today in carefully controlled settings, its early applications were far from gentle. Doctors would administer jolts of electricity strong enough to induce seizures, often without anesthesia or consent. The goal? To reset the brain, like shaking a faulty light bulb. For some patients, particularly those with severe depression, it brought real relief. But for others, it caused memory loss, confusion, and trauma. This was the golden age of interventionist psychiatry. Insulin coma therapy, hydrotherapy, isolation chambers, doctors reached for any lever they could pull. Mental illness was treated like a broken machine, and the tools were crude. Compassion took a back seat to control. And still, asylums swelled. With the rise of state-run psychiatric hospitals, millions were institutionalized. Some stayed for decades, forgotten by families and society. The average person feared these places. Stories of abuse, neglect, and restraint leaked into tabloids and horror films. The mentally ill became monsters in pop culture. Mad scientists, escaped killers, the unhinged. The intentions were scientific, the outcomes often tragic. And as the 1960s approached, a new idea began to grow. Maybe it wasn't the patients who needed fixing. Maybe it was the system itself. By the 1960s, the tide was turning. Public trust in asylums had eroded. Investigative journalists exposed filthy wards, over-medicated patients, and inhumane conditions in state hospitals. Families stopped believing the promise of restorative care, and legislators started asking uncomfortable questions. Was institutionalization actually helping anyone, or was it simply warehousing the unwanted? Enter the movement known as deinstitutionalization. Fueled by three major forces, new medications, civil rights advocacy, and cost-cutting governments, the idea was simple: close the big institutions and treat people in their communities instead. Antipsychotic drugs like Thorazine, introduced in the 1950s, made it possible to manage schizophrenia and other severe conditions outside the hospital. For the first time in centuries, the mentally ill could, at least in theory, live freely with pharmaceutical support. President John F. Kennedy, whose own sister Rosemary had been lobotomized into near silence, became a vocal advocate for mental health reform. In 1963, he signed a bill funding hundreds of community mental health centers, designed to offer outpatient care, housing support, and therapy. The goal: independence, dignity, and reintegration. The closures began swiftly. Massive institutions that once held thousands were emptied within a decade. The image of the padded cell gave way to that of the neighborhood clinic. Patients were no longer confined, but encouraged to live in halfway houses, with social workers checking in. On paper, it was a humanitarian triumph. In practice, it was chaotic. Why? Because the infrastructure never fully materialized. Many of the community clinics were underfunded, understaffed, or never built at all. Patients released from long-term institutions found themselves on the streets with nowhere to go. Families weren't prepared. Law enforcement wasn't trained. Suddenly, the burden shifted from medical professionals to social services, jails, and shelters. Homelessness rates rose, so did incarceration. A significant portion of the prison population began showing signs of untreated mental illness. Deinstitutionalization wasn't entirely a failure, but it became a cautionary tale. Compassion without preparation isn't a solution. It's just displacement. Still, the movement changed everything. It forced society to admit that locking people away indefinitely was not humane care. It brought mental illness into the public square, into conversations, policies, and eventually media. It laid the groundwork for patient rights, ethical treatment, and a more holistic approach. But for many, especially the poor and marginalized, the promise of dignified care remained just that, a promise. Today, mental illness is no longer confined to asylums or dismissed as witchcraft, but that doesn't mean it's fully understood or even widely accepted. The 21st century has brought massive strides in neuroscience, psychology, and therapy, yet stigma clings like a shadow. For all our scientific vocabulary, we still flinch at words like bipolar, schizophrenic, or borderline. Thanks to brain imaging, we now know that conditions like depression and anxiety aren't just in your head in the dismissive sense. They involve real, measurable changes in brain chemistry, structure, and function. Genetic research has linked certain disorders to hereditary factors. Environmental trauma, childhood neglect, and even gut health are now recognized as contributors to mental instability. For the first time, we're beginning to see mental illness as a dynamic intersection of biology, psychology, and environment. But understanding doesn't always equal empathy. Social media has helped normalize conversations around mental health, especially among younger generations. Celebrities now talk openly about anxiety, therapy, and medication. Apps offer guided meditation, therapy sessions, and mood tracking. And yet, access to real treatment is still painfully unequal. Rural communities, low-income populations, and minorities often face insurmountable barriers to care. Meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry, though crucial in many respects, has also been criticized for overprescription, especially of antidepressants and stimulants. Some patients feel treated as checkboxes on a diagnostic form, briefly seen, quickly medicated, and rarely heard. Therapy, once stigmatized, is now a billion-dollar industry, but it's still out of reach for many. And old ghosts linger. Homeless populations are still disproportionately composed of those with untreated mental illnesses. Prisons now serve as the largest de facto mental health institutions in many countries. Emergency rooms are flooded with psychiatric crises they aren't equipped to handle. It's deinstitutionalization without the promised safety net, again. Yet there are signs of hope. Trauma-informed care is gaining ground. Peer support programs are flourishing. Schools are beginning to integrate mental wellness into curriculums. Movements for neurodiversity challenge the notion of a single, correct mind. And therapy is no longer whispered, it's recommended. But the work is far from done. Mental illness may no longer be chained to a wall or cut from the brain, but many still suffer in silence, buried under cultural shame and systemic failure. History has shown us what not to do. The future will be defined by whether we finally start doing better. Bushido, meaning the way of the warrior, was not a law written by emperors or carved into stone. It lived in the hearts of the samurai, whispered through generations, inked in poetry, and sharpened into steel. It governed everything a warrior did, from how he fought, to how he lived, and, most importantly, how he died. Emerging during Japan's feudal era, Bushido evolved over centuries, drawing from a mixture of Shinto reverence, Buddhist calm, and Confucian discipline. It demanded 7 core virtues: loyalty, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and rectitude. These weren't vague ideals. They were lived obligations. A samurai who violated one could expect social exile, or a far more gruesome end. Loyalty wasn't negotiable. A samurai swore unwavering allegiance to his daimyo, his feudal lord. Betrayal wasn't seen as political treason. It was spiritual pollution. Even in defeat, a loyal retainer might choose death over dishonor. The concept of giri, an unrepayable sense of duty, bound him tighter than any contract. And death? That was never the enemy. The ideal samurai embraced it daily, preparing his soul for the moment when duty would demand the ultimate price. If he failed his master, displayed cowardice, or brought shame to his name, there was one way to reclaim dignity: seppuku. With stoic calm, he would plunge a blade into his abdomen and slice sideways, spilling both pain and guilt onto the tatami mat. A second, called the kaishakunin, would stand behind him, ready to deliver a clean beheading and spare him prolonged agony. To Westerners, this might sound horrific, but to the samurai, it was beautiful, a final poem written in blood. Bushido didn't die with the swords. Even after Japan modernized and the samurai class was dissolved, echoes of Bushido lingered. It shaped the ethos of Japanese military officers during World War II and still lives on today in martial arts, business culture, and national pride. What makes Bushido extraordinary isn't just its severity. It's that it demanded honor, not just in victory, but in restraint, humility, and even in death. The sword was sacred, but it was never the point. A true warrior, under Bushido, didn't just master combat, he mastered himself. And when the final moment came, he met death not with fear, but with dignity. In the frost-bitten lands of Scandinavia, the Viking warrior code was carved in fire and blood. It had no formal scripture, no single name like Bushido, but it was etched into their sagas, their graves, and their gods. At its core was a stark belief. Death comes for everyone, so die well. Viking honor revolved around bravery, loyalty, and reputation. The Norse didn't seek peaceful deaths in their beds. They sought battle. To fall with a weapon in hand was the dream, not the tragedy. Why? Because of Valhalla. In Viking cosmology, warriors who died courageously were chosen by the Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, to ascend to Valhalla, a warrior's paradise where they would feast, fight, and prepare for Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. But if you died a coward, your soul was cast into hell, a dreary underworld of shame. This belief shaped how Vikings lived. Raiding, pillaging, and conquest weren't just acts of survival. They were rites of glory. Cowardice wasn't just embarrassing, it was spiritually damning. To flee a battle was to stain your lineage. Even their funerals reflected this ethos. Warriors were buried with weapons, shields, even sacrificed horses or slaves, everything needed for the afterlife's endless war games. Loyalty to one's jarl or king was another pillar. Viking warriors known as herdmen formed tight-knit bands bound by oaths. Betrayal of the group was unthinkable. But that didn't mean blind obedience. Vikings valued personal honor as much as loyalty. If a leader lost face or made cowardly decisions, his men could challenge or even abandon him. Strength commanded loyalty. Weakness lost it. And vengeance? That was a virtue. If your kin was wronged or your honor insulted, you were expected to respond, with steel. Feuds could last generations, spilling over into blood debts and cycles of retribution. It wasn't cruelty, it was balance. The sagas are filled with heroes who refused compensation or peace until justice was served blade to blade. Even in old age, many Vikings feared a quiet death more than pain. Some sought out danger in their final years, hoping to die in a glorious skirmish rather than waste away in bed. Anything was better than being forgotten, because for the Vikings, death was not the end. It was an audition for eternity, and only the brave made the cut. To be a Roman soldier was not simply to fight, it was to embody virtues, a word that blended virtue, valour, manliness and civic duty into a single, brutal code of conduct. A Roman warrior wasn't just a killer, he was a disciplined extension of the Republic, or the Emperor's will, a walking symbol of order in a chaotic world. The ideal Roman warrior didn't crave individual glory. He earned honour by obeying orders, enduring pain, and never flinching in the face of death. Cowardice was unthinkable. A legionnaire who fled battle wasn't just punished, he was erased from respectability. In some cases, entire units were subjected to decimation, a horrific form of discipline where 1 in every 10 men was executed by their comrades to restore obedience. The Roman warrior code was built on structure. Training was constant, relentless, and grueling. Discipline was more important than strength. A soldier who broke ranks even in victory could face lashes or execution. Glory belonged to Rome, not the man. This collectivism set the Roman military apart from most ancient forces. It was less a band of warriors and more a machine. But virtues extended beyond the battlefield. It was a societal expectation for Roman men, especially those of noble birth, to show courage in the Senate, to be just in leadership, and to display restraint in personal ambition were also considered marks of warrior honour. Even retired soldiers were expected to carry themselves with dignity, as living monuments to Rome's greatness. One of the most sacred virtues in Roman military culture was fides, faith or loyalty. Loyalty to your unit, your commander, and to Rome itself. Betrayal, insubordination, or desertion were treated with utter contempt. Think of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. It wasn't just a political act, it was a defiance of the warrior code's loyalty to the Republic. Death was not feared. Dying in battle, especially for Rome, was the highest honour. Tombstones of Roman soldiers often boasted of where and how they died, listing campaigns like a resume for the gods. Unlike the Vikings, who sought personal glory in Valhalla, or the samurai, who died for their lords, Romans fought for the enduring myth of civilization. They weren't just defending borders. They were exporting order and enforcing it with spears. For the Roman warrior, the code was clear: obey, endure, conquer, and die like a citizen of eternity. In medieval Europe, the warrior wasn't just a killer. He was supposed to be a Christian killer. Enter the code of chivalry, an unwritten, romanticized set of ideals meant to tame the bloodlust of knights with the nobility of saints. At least that was the idea. The word chivalry comes from the French chevalier, meaning horseman. And in a world where heavy cavalry ruled the battlefield, knights needed more than armour and swords. They needed a moral compass, or at least the church thought so. The chivalric code combined martial prowess with piety, loyalty, and, yes, courtly love. A true knight was expected to be brave in battle, loyal to his liege, generous to the poor and protective of women and the weak. He was to pray often, fight fairly, and never lie. Of course, this ideal existed mostly in literature and sermons. In practice, knights could be brutal warlords with a crucifix in one hand and a torch in the other. Still, the code had real influence. During the Crusades, for instance, knights were told they were not merely fighting for land or glory, but for God himself. Killing in battle wasn't a sin if it was done in the name of Christ. It was holy. The result? Some of the bloodiest campaigns in history, wrapped in righteous rhetoric. Chivalry also demanded loyalty, fealty to one's lord. A knight swore oaths of service, often sealed on sacred relics. Betraying that oath was considered not just treason, but sacrilege. And when a knight broke the code, he wasn't just punished by men, he was believed to be judged by heaven. Then there was courtly love, the strangest part of the chivalric tradition. Knights were supposed to pine for noble ladies, usually married, and dedicate heroic deeds to their honour. Love was supposed to be chaste, poetic, and maddening. Basically, it gave violent men something to write about when they weren't beheading each other. Of course, chivalry didn't apply to peasants. Knights could sack villages, burn crops, and execute rebels without guilt, so long as it wasn't another noble's land. The code was selective, idealistic, and often hypocritical, but it created a powerful mythos that shaped European culture for centuries. The knight's code wasn't just about wielding a sword, it was about justifying it. Chivalry turned warfare into ritual, loyalty into law, and honour into theatre. If other warrior codes danced between honour and poetry, the Spartan code came with no frills, no romance, just stone-hard discipline and absolute obedience. Sparta, the ancient Greek city-state, built its identity on the idea that every male citizen was a soldier first, and everything else second. In Sparta, war wasn't a profession, it was life itself. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his body was judged. If he was weak or deformed, he was discarded. If he passed inspection, he was handed over to the Agog, a state-run military training program that raised boys into lethal instruments of war. There was no room for softness, no room for doubt. The Agog taught them to fight, steal, endure pain, and above all, obey without question. Spartan boys learned to speak in short, sharp phrases, laconic wit it was called. Talk less, do more. They were taught to sleep on reeds, wear minimal clothing in the cold, and go hungry without complaint. Courage wasn't just admired, it was mandatory. A Spartan who ran from battle wasn't just a disgrace, he was stripped of citizenship, scorned by women, and made a pariah. The ultimate commandment of the Spartan code? Never return without your shield. That didn't mean don't lose it. It meant don't come back unless you're carrying it, or being carried on it. In other words, win or die trying. Anything less was treason. And loyalty? It ran so deep that Spartan soldiers would rather fall to the last man than break formation. The phalanx, their tightly packed battle line, required every warrior to hold the shield of the man next to him. Breaking formation meant exposing your brothers to death. It wasn't just a tactical failure, it was moral collapse. The Spartan code also expected total submission to the state. Spartans weren't free in the modern sense. Their lives were dictated by duty. Duty to Sparta, to the army, to the gods of war. Even marriage and family life were secondary. Wives encouraged their husbands to die gloriously. Mothers told their sons, "Come back with your shield, or on it." In Sparta, the individual didn't matter. Glory didn't come from lone heroism, but from disappearing into the machine of war. Their strength was unity. Their honour in sacrifice. And for centuries, no one dared challenge the phalanx. Because Spartans didn't just fight like warriors, they lived like weapons. If the samurai lived by honour and the Spartans by discipline, the Mongol warrior lived by the cold clarity of results. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols built the largest contiguous empire in history, not through overwhelming numbers, but through speed, precision, and a ruthless warrior code that valued loyalty, adaptability, and total obedience. At the heart of this code was allegiance to the Khan. Mongol warriors swore personal loyalty to their commander, and breaking that bond was unthinkable. Betrayal was punished not just with death, but with obliteration. Genghis Khan made it clear: loyalty ensured survival, disobedience ensured extinction. Mongol discipline wasn't born in cities. It was forged in the brutal steppes of Central Asia. Nomadic life demanded toughness. From a young age, Mongol boys learned to ride horses, shoot bows, and survive with minimal supplies. A Mongol could go for days with no fire, live off dried meat and fermented milk, and shoot with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. That wasn't a skill, it was a cultural expectation. The Mongols didn't believe in individual glory. They operated as a single, moving organism. Every warrior was expected to follow the Yasa, a codified set of laws attributed to Genghis Khan. These laws emphasized military discipline, meritocracy, and strict punishment. Looting without permission, executed. Disobeying orders, executed. Cowardice in battle, you guessed it, executed. But they weren't mindless brutes. The Mongol code emphasized strategy over chaos. They mastered psychological warfare, often pretending to retreat, only to ambush pursuing enemies. They spared cities that surrendered and annihilated those that resisted, sending a brutal message to others. Merit also played a key role. Unlike many medieval systems where birth mattered most, Mongol officers were promoted based on skill and loyalty, not noble bloodlines. If a peasant proved himself on the battlefield, he could rise through the ranks. In this way, the Mongol code was shockingly progressive for its time, rewarding competence over class. Perhaps the most terrifying part of their ethos? Detachment. Mongol warriors viewed war not as a moral conflict, but as an inevitability. Death wasn't personal, it was a tool. They didn't seek honor like knights, or spiritual purification like samurai. They sought victory, and they almost always got it. The Mongol code wasn't romantic. It was efficient, mobile, and devastating. It made warriors not of marble or myth, but of blood, bone, and pure resolve. The warriors of the Zulu kingdom weren't forged in myth. They were trained by fire, sweat, and a revolutionary named Shaka Zulu. In the early 19th century, Shaka transformed a fragmented cluster of clans into a disciplined, militarized force that shook southern Africa to its core. And at the center of it all was a warrior code grounded in unity, courage, and absolute loyalty to the king. Shaka introduced radical changes to Zulu warfare and to Zulu identity. He replaced the throwing spear with the ikulwa, a short stabbing spear ideal for close combat. He mandated the use of large cowhide shields and organized warriors into tightly knit regiments called impi, each living, training, and marching together like family. But this wasn't just tactical innovation, it was ideological transformation. The Zulu warrior was no longer a part-time fighter. He was a servant of the nation, a living shield. Warriors were grouped by age and trained in rigorous discipline from adolescence. They were forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in battle, a way to tie honor to service. The warrior didn't fight for individual glory, but for the survival and expansion of the Zulu people. Their bond was sacred, their formation unbreakable. Cowardice was not an option. To turn your back on the enemy or break ranks during a charge was a stain worse than death. Those who fled were executed publicly. Those who stood firm were celebrated, often with promotions, cattle, and prestige. Bravery was the currency of masculinity, and warriors were expected to give everything, including their lives, without hesitation. Loyalty to the king was absolute. Shaka ruled with charisma and terror, and his warriors revered him like a deity. Disobedience was met with swift, often fatal punishment, but in return, the king cared for his impis, offering food, protection, and recognition. Zulu warfare emphasized not just strength, but psychology. Shaka's famous buffalo horn formation, with a chest, horns, and loins, allowed his forces to envelop enemies with terrifying precision. Every warrior had a place, and every death was part of a larger purpose. The Zulu warrior code turned a tribal society into a military state, and ordinary men into legends. They didn't fight for conquest alone. They fought as one body, one heartbeat, one shield. And when the spears rose, even empires learned to tremble. Among the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest, the Apache warrior carved a legacy not through empires or grand armies, but through resilience, stealth, and a code of survival that defied conquest. For the Apache, warfare wasn't just a duty. It was a daily act of existence in a land that was as harsh as it was sacred. Unlike centralized warrior cultures, the Apache didn't organize around kings or empires. Their code wasn't written in law or dictated by generals. It was taught through oral tradition, lived experience, and necessity. In a world surrounded by hostile tribes, expanding settlers, and US military campaigns, Apache warriors developed a combat philosophy built on mobility, precision, and endurance. At the heart of the Apache code was self-discipline. Boys were trained from an early age to endure pain, hunger, thirst, and silence. Running long distances barefoot, bathing in icy rivers, and fasting were all rites of passage. A true warrior needed more than a strong arm. He needed an iron will. He had to read the land like a book, track enemies by broken twigs, and vanish into cliffs without a sound. Silence was considered a virtue. Boasting was frowned upon. Actions spoke louder than words, and warriors who performed bravely in battle often received no outward reward, only the quiet respect of the tribe. Stealth and cunning were prized as much as bravery. The Apache didn't see ambushes or hit-and-run tactics as dishonorable. They saw them as smart. Loyalty to one's band and family was sacred. The Apache didn't fight for conquest. They fought for protection. Warriors were defenders of the homeland, guardians of the community. Retaliation for raids, broken treaties, or slain kin was not only expected, it was demanded. Yet vengeance was always measured. Recklessness had no place in their code. And when it came to resistance, few cultures endured more pressure. Leaders like Geronimo became symbols of unbroken defiance, leading guerrilla campaigns against overwhelming odds. Even when captured, exiled, or imprisoned, many Apache warriors refused to surrender spiritually. Their code had no room for submission. To the outside world, the Apache were often seen as savages, but within their culture, the warrior was a keeper of balance, calm in voice, sharp in eye, deadly in motion. They weren't chasing glory. They were keeping the world intact, one silent step at a time. In the heart of 17th century India, amid the clash of empires and the oppression of faiths, arose a warrior brotherhood unlike any other, the Khalsa, the Saint Soldiers of Sikhism. Formed by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699, the Khalsa wasn't just a fighting force. It was a moral revolution wrapped in armour, driven by a code that combined spiritual devotion with fearless resistance. The Sikh warrior code was revolutionary in two ways. First, it was egalitarian. The Khalsa rejected caste, wealth, and lineage. Every member took the same last name, Singh, meaning lion, to erase social divisions. A lowly farmer stood shoulder to shoulder with a prince. They fought not for conquest, but for justice, for the protection of the oppressed, regardless of religion or origin. Second, it demanded unshakable discipline. Upon initiation, Khalsa warriors vowed to uphold righteousness, never cut their hair, never engage in intoxication, and never harm the defenseless. They bore 5 symbols, the 5 Ks: Kesh, uncut hair; Kara, iron bracelet; Kanga, wooden comb; Kashera, shorts; and Kirpan, a ceremonial sword. Each carried spiritual meaning, but the Kirpan especially signified the duty to stand against tyranny. The code was built around the concept of miri piri, a balance of temporal power and spiritual wisdom. A Khalsa warrior wasn't just a fighter. He was expected to meditate, serve others, and remain humble, even in battle. Warfare was a last resort, never to be driven by ego or vengeance, but only to defend righteousness. Fighting was not about rage. It was about responsibility, and when they fought fiercely. Khalsa warriors stood against the powerful Mughal Empire, often outnumbered but never outwilled. Their battle cry wasn't just a slogan, it was a declaration of purpose. Betrayal of the code was rare because it was tied to one's very identity. To be Khalsa was not just a title, it was a vow, a sacred pact of courage, service, and self-sacrifice. The Sikh warrior didn't fight for glory, land, or empire. He fought because it was his divine duty, and in doing so, the Khalsa forged a legacy of fearless equality that still inspires warriors of conscience to this day. Long before the first bottle was smashed or the first speakeasy opened its doors, America was already fighting a war against alcohol. By the late 1800s, the country's relationship with drinking had spiraled out of control. Booze wasn't just a pastime, it was a daily fixture. Saloons weren't merely watering holes, they were political clubs, gambling dens, and brothels. Public drunkenness was widespread, and many reformers pointed to alcohol as the root of domestic violence, poverty, and moral decay. Enter the temperance movement, a coalition of activists, church leaders, and political crusaders who saw alcohol not as a personal vice, but a national crisis. One of the loudest voices came from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, whose members marched, picketed, and prayed outside saloons, urging men to give up their drink for the sake of their families. They were joined by the Anti-Saloon League, a group that didn't just protest, they played politics, and they played to win. The Anti-Saloon League understood something critical. Laws change when you change lawmakers. So they lobbied hard, targeting local, state, and federal elections to get dry candidates into office. By the early 1900s, they had built an astonishingly effective political machine. They pressured politicians, funded campaigns, and used propaganda to paint alcohol as a threat to the American way of life. But there was more than morality behind the movement. There was fear and nationalism. Immigrant communities, especially Germans, Irish, and Italians, were often associated with heavy drinking. For many native-born Protestants, the saloon wasn't just a vice, it was a symbol of foreign influence and cultural division. As World War I broke out, anti-German sentiment surged, and beer, heavily associated with German-American brewers, became a target of patriotic disdain. The stage was set. On January 16, 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The following year, the Volstead Act was passed to enforce it. America was officially dry. But rather than usher in a golden age of sobriety and virtue, prohibition would instead uncork something far more chaotic: black markets, bootlegging, and bloodshed. The crusade had won the law, but the fight for the soul of a thirsty nation was just beginning. Prohibition might have started with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, but it was the Volstead Act that gave the law teeth and plenty of fine print. Named after Congressman Andrew Volstead, who championed its passage in Congress, the Act defined what intoxicating liquor actually meant. Spoiler: it didn't just ban hard liquor, it banned anything with more than 0.5% alcohol content. That included beer, wine, cider, even medicinal tonics. Suddenly, the ordinary became illegal, but as strict as the Volstead Act sounded, It was also riddled with loopholes, contradictions, and legal gymnastics that turned enforcement into a nightmare. For starters, Prohibition didn't make it illegal to drink alcohol. You could still drink it, you just couldn't sell it, transport it, or make it. That meant if you had a cellar full of wine or a few barrels of whiskey before the law kicked in, you were technically safe. Private stockpiling became a booming side hustle, and many wealthy Americans bought up entire inventories before the ban took effect. Then there were the religious exemptions. Wine for communion? Still legal. Suddenly, churches, some real, some hastily fabricated, saw their memberships skyrocket. Clergy found themselves in the unusual position of acting as both spiritual leaders and alcohol distributors. One priest joked that his congregation had grown miraculously overnight. Medical loopholes were even more absurd. Doctors could prescribe alcohol for medicinal purposes, and pharmacies could legally dispense it. That led to an explosion of shady prescriptions and booming business for chains like Walgreens, which grew from 20 stores to over 500 during Prohibition. Bourbon for a cough? Brandy for your nerves? Step right up. Meanwhile, enforcement fell to the newly formed Prohibition Bureau, a severely underfunded and often corrupt agency that couldn't keep up. Many agents were either bribed, intimidated, or simply overwhelmed. Raids were inconsistent, penalties often lenient, and bootleggers were always a step ahead. The Volstead Act, in theory, was supposed to engineer a sober society through strict control. In practice, it created a tangled mess of grey zones, selective enforcement, and fertile ground for a booming underground economy. As the Volstead Act took effect and legal alcohol vanished from shelves, something else began to flourish in the shadows: the speakeasy. These illicit bars and nightclubs sprang up in basements, back rooms, and behind sliding walls in cities across America. The term speakeasy came from patrons being told to speak easy about their location, because if the wrong person overheard, the party might end in a police raid. But those raids? Rarely successful. Speakeasies weren't just hiding, they were protected. By the mid-1920s, there were tens of thousands of speakeasies in New York alone. Many operated in plain sight, bribing local officials and cops to look the other way. A raid might occur for show, but behind the scenes, cash changed hands, and doors reopened within hours. Inside, the scene was electric. Jazz bands played wild improvisations. Women in flapper dresses drank alongside men in tuxedos. For the first time, social mixing was part of the drinking culture. Speakeasies broke barriers between classes, between races, between genders. In many urban speakeasies, white patrons danced to black music, and women smoked, drank, and flirted openly. It was rebellious, glamorous, and intoxicating in every sense. But the booze? It was often questionable at best and deadly at worst. With legal distilleries shut down, bootleggers began manufacturing alcohol in hidden labs and bathtubs. This bathtub gin was often crude, unregulated, and spiked with dangerous chemicals to stretch supply. Blindness and poisoning were not uncommon. Still, the demand was so high, people were willing to take the risk. Speakeasies were more than bars. They were symbols of defiance. They represented the failure of Prohibition to stamp out America's love affair with alcohol. The harder the government tried to enforce the ban, the more the public found creative ways around it. Hidden compartments, secret passwords, false storefronts. Prohibition turned ordinary citizens into everyday outlaws. In the process, nightlife transformed. Jazz culture exploded. Fashion changed. Even slang evolved, with terms like juice joint, giggle water, and bootleg becoming part of everyday speech. The speakeasy wasn't just a workaround. It was a cultural revolution in disguise. Prohibition had aimed to make America sober and righteous. Instead, it made the country sneakier, bolder, and infinitely more rebellious. As Prohibition pushed alcohol underground, organized crime stepped into the spotlight, armed, ambitious, and eager to supply what the government had banned. With booze illegal and demand skyrocketing, a black market economy was born, and at its heart were the gangsters who turned alcohol into a billion-dollar business. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in Chicago, where Al Capone became the face of the Prohibition underworld. Capone wasn't just a thug. He was a businessman, a strategist, and a public figure who provided jobs, ran soup kitchens, and bribed the police with pocket change. But behind the public image was a ruthless enforcer who ruled through violence, fear, and corruption. Capone's empire trafficked in thousands of gallons of illegal liquor, moving it through secret warehouses, armed convoys, and crooked speakeasies. He had entire neighborhoods under his thumb, judges, mayors, even law enforcement, and he wasn't alone. Across the country, cities like New York, Detroit, and Kansas City saw the rise of bootleg kings, Irish mobs, Sicilian mafias, and Jewish crime syndicates, all using Prohibition as their golden ticket. These criminal networks didn't just move alcohol, they professionalized crime. They created systems, hierarchies, and rules. Turf wars were common, and blood spilled often. One of the most infamous events was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 members of a rival gang were lined up and gunned down in broad daylight, allegedly on Capone's orders. The message was clear. This wasn't small-time street violence. This was organized warfare. Ironically, the more the federal government cracked down, the more sophisticated the criminals became. Smugglers used fast boats on the coasts and cars modified with hidden compartments inland. Some even built tunnels under the US-Canada border to ferry in whiskey from Montreal. Others had insiders at distilleries still legally producing medical or industrial alcohol, which was then repurposed into bootleg spirits. Public sentiment began to shift. People questioned a law that seemed to breed more crime than it prevented. What began as a moral crusade was now enabling the rise of criminal empires more powerful and violent than anything the country had ever seen. While bootleggers and gangsters flourished in back alleys and secret warehouses, the federal government tried desperately to hold the line. Enter the Prohibition agents, or as they came to be known, the G-men. Tasked with enforcing the Volstead Act, these men were supposed to be America's moral guardians, hunting down illegal liquor and bringing order to a nation gone rogue. But there was one problem. Almost everything was stacked against them. When Prohibition began, there were fewer than 1,500 federal agents assigned to enforce it nationwide. That's one agent for every 70,000 people. These men were poorly trained, underpaid, and overwhelmed. And it didn't take long for corruption to seep in. With gangsters offering bribes that far outpaced a government paycheck, many agents looked the other way, or actively participated in the very crimes they were hired to stop. Still, not all G-men were crooked. Some, like Elliot Ness, gained fame for their dedication. Ness led a team called the Untouchables, known for their refusal to take bribes and their relentless pursuit of Al Capone's empire. They smashed stills, raided warehouses, and tried to bring order to lawless Chicago. But even Ness couldn't bring Capone down through Prohibition law. That job eventually fell to the IRS, who nailed him for tax evasion, not bootlegging. Most enforcement efforts were clumsy at best and dangerous at worst. Raids were often tipped off in advance. Innocent people were sometimes caught in the chaos, and the black market just adapted. Bootleggers became masters of deception, changing routes, disguising shipments, and creating networks that moved faster than the law. The government even took a darker turn. In an attempt to stop people from drinking industrial alcohol used in bootlegging, federal officials ordered it poisoned. Thousands were sickened and hundreds died. The press called it government murder. Public opinion, already sour, turned bitter. All of this contributed to a growing sense that prohibition was unenforceable, and worse, unjust. Law-abiding citizens became criminals overnight, and real criminals became rich, powerful, and untouchable. While lawmakers tried to legislate morality and G-men chased bootleggers through alleys, American culture was undergoing a revolution of its own. Prohibition didn't just change the law, it changed the vibe. And in that chaotic, intoxicating space, new voices rose, new rhythms exploded, and a new kind of American identity emerged. At the center of it all, women. The very movement that pushed for prohibition, led in large part by women's groups, had unintentionally opened a cultural door they couldn't close. With the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote just before Prohibition began, women suddenly had more political power, more visibility, and more freedom to redefine their roles in society. In the roaring cities, the image of the flapper was born. She smoked, she drank, she cut her hair short, danced in public, wore scandalous dresses that showed ankles and knees, and rejected the quiet submissiveness expected of previous generations. She wasn't just breaking social norms, she was obliterating them. And where did she go to express all this rebellion? The speakeasy, of course. There, women and men mixed freely. For many, this was the first time they could socialize as equals, sharing drinks and dancing shoulder to shoulder. The strict rules of Victorian etiquette melted under the heat of swing and saxophones. This was the jazz age, a cultural eruption that changed American music forever. Jazz was born in black communities in New Orleans, but spread through Prohibition like wildfire. It was loud, wild, improvisational, and unapologetically modern. Clubs like the Cotton Club in Harlem attracted white patrons eager to hear black musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, even as segregation remained outside the door. Alongside music, Prohibition inspired a literary boom. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald captured the decadence, disillusionment, and booze-soaked chaos of the 1920s. The American dream was being rewritten, in real time, with gin on the rocks. Even fashion shifted. Clothes became less restrictive, hairstyles shorter, morals looser. What had started as a movement to clean up society accidentally sparked a generation of people determined to break every rule. Prohibition didn't purify culture. It unleashed it. In the vacuum created by repression, art, expression, and rebellion thrived. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the United States was hit by an earthquake that shook every corner of society. The Great Depression. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and breadlines stretched for blocks. Amid this growing desperation, the grand moral crusade of Prohibition started to look less like virtue, and more like a luxury the country could no longer afford. Suddenly, the idea of banning alcohol wasn't just inconvenient. It was economically devastating. Legalizing alcohol again meant potential jobs, tax revenue, and economic relief. Before Prohibition, alcohol taxes accounted for up to 30% of federal income. Now, the government was broke, and so were the people. Repeal started to make more sense than ever, not just to the public, but to politicians. President Herbert Hoover, who called Prohibition a noble experiment, found himself increasingly out of step with the national mood. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency in 1932, he openly supported repeal as part of his New Deal platform. His victory was a turning point, not just politically, but culturally. Americans were ready to drink legally again. The final blow came with the ratification of the 21st Amendment in December 1933, which officially repealed the 18th. For the first time in US history, a constitutional amendment was erased by another. Champagne corks popped from coast to coast, bars reopened, breweries retooled. A great sigh of relief swept the nation, not just because alcohol was legal again, but because a long national contradiction had finally ended. But the damage was already done. The black market that Prohibition created didn't disappear overnight. Organised crime had grown too strong, too rich, and too embedded in urban power structures to simply walk away. Gangsters who once ran bootlegging operations moved into gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. The federal government had created a monster, and killing it would take decades. Culturally, the era left scars and legends. Speakeasies, jazz, flappers, and gangsters became part of the American mythos. Prohibition had failed in its mission to sober the nation, but it succeeded in reshaping it entirely. Even after the cork was popped on Prohibition's official end in 1933, its legacy didn't just evaporate. The social, political, and criminal consequences of the era stuck around, and in many ways still echo through American life today. The most obvious impact? Organised crime didn't go away. It adapted. The bootlegging empires built during Prohibition gave rise to modern mafia syndicates. The smuggling routes, bribery systems, and networks of corruption had grown so sophisticated that criminal organisations simply shifted gears into narcotics, gambling, extortion, and labour racketeering. The violence didn't disappear either. Prohibition had given crime families power, and they weren't giving it back. The era also transformed American law enforcement. The failure to control alcohol exposed how weak and fragmented the federal government's policing power truly was. In response, the FBI expanded, surveillance techniques were refined, and law enforcement became more centralized and professionalized. The modern American war on crime was born from the ashes of a failed war on liquor. On the political front, Prohibition revealed the dangers of legislating morality on a national scale. What started as a movement to uplift the moral character of the country turned into an exercise in hypocrisy and rebellion. Voters, especially in urban areas, learned that laws disconnected from public behaviour are doomed. The experience left many Americans skeptical of future moral crusades and wary of politicians promising purity through policy. Then there was the cultural shift. Prohibition inadvertently sparked a broader distrust of government overreach. People resented being told how to live, drink, and socialise. The resentment would resurface in later decades, from anti-smoking campaigns to debates about drug legalisation. The ghost of the Volstead Act haunts American culture every time there's a clash between law and lifestyle. Even the alcohol industry had to rebuild itself from the ground up. In the decades following repeal, regulations were introduced to control advertising, drinking ages, and distribution. To this day, liquor laws in the US vary wildly from state to state, a messy legacy of the fractured Prohibition years. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was psychological. Prohibition taught Americans that banning something doesn't make it disappear, it just pushes it underground. Long after the last speakeasy closed and the final bootlegger faded into history, the Prohibition era found a second life, this time in pop culture. What had once been a decade of legal chaos and blood-soaked crime became a glittering myth of gangsters in pinstripe suits, jazz-filled clubs, and rebellious glamour. Prohibition didn't just leave behind laws, it left behind legends. Hollywood wasted no time. Films like Little Caesar, 1931, and The Public Enemy, 1931, turned bootleggers into icons. James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson didn't just play gangsters, they defined them. Al Capone was no longer just a criminal. He was a celebrity anti-hero. The lines between villain and folk hero blurred, and America fell in love with the very men the government had tried to erase. The trend continued through the decades. The Untouchables, Once Upon a Time in America, Boardwalk Empire. Each retelling added more glamour, more grit, and more mythology to an era that had been, in reality, chaotic and often brutal. Speakeasies, once underground dens of questionable booze, were reimagined as classy lounges filled with swing music and Art Deco charm. Even the language of the time stuck. Words like bootleg, giggle water, juice joint, and hooch still crop up in retro bars and themed parties. The flapper look, with its fringe dresses and bobbed hair, remains a fashion staple in costume culture. And jazz, the soundtrack of rebellion during Prohibition, became a defining symbol of American creativity. But it wasn't just entertainment. The Prohibition story became a moral parable, taught in schools, debated in political circles, and invoked every time a new movement tried to ban something. Whether it's cannabis laws, internet censorship, or dietary restrictions, critics often ask, are we repeating Prohibition? It also helped fuel the American fascination with the outlaw hero. The idea that when laws go too far, it's not just acceptable to break them, it's patriotic. This mindset, rooted in Prohibition's speakeasy culture, continues to shape attitudes toward authority and rebellion. In the end, Prohibition failed to make America sober, but it succeeded in making it legendary. It became a story not just about law and order, but about resistance, culture, and the power of unintended consequences.